Hi everyone, my name is Colton. This is Natalie and this is Logan. And today on this episode we are talking about minorities in the 1940s and their contributions to war. Colton? Thank you, Colton. So one of the major minority groups that helped out during World War II were African Americans. There were over 2.5 million African Americans that volunteered for the draft during World War II. The many African American women that also volunteered were in large numbers, and when combined with the African American men, more than 1 million African Americans served the army during the war.
During World War II, thousands of African Americans migrated from southern farms to fill jobs in northern and western factories.
There have been two great migrations of African American population within the United States. The first began shortly before World War I and continued through the war.
As seen in the video, many African Americans migrated here because of in search of jobs, such jobs as going to the war, working on ranches, or working on factories. Most of these African Americans would help process materials and which would make items that would help the men serving in the war, and many African American women would enlist in Women Army Corps to help out around the house and fulfill jobs of men that went to war. Thank you, Colton. Logan?
During World War I, the United States had used Choctaw code talkers. So as a result, the Japanese and the German both had already studied the Choctaw Native American language by the time World War II rolled around. So the United States government had to come up with new codes. So that's when they turned to the Navajo tribe, whose language was unique because it was unwritten, and it was also very tonal language, so only fluent speakers could decipher the codes that they developed. There were originally 29 code talkers, but that number grew to over 400 by the end of the war. And the Navajo code talkers had 100% success rate, so none of the codes were ever deciphered by the Japanese or the Germans.
Thank you, Logan. Natalie?
Thank you so much, Logan. And today I'm going to be talking about the Mexican Americans and the race relation during the 40s. By 1940, people of Mexican descent in the U.S. were twice as likely to be born and raised in the States than not, and a second mass migration converted Los Angeles into one of the most racially diverse cities in the country. The industrialization of the United States, fueled by the war effort and decrease in the labor forces, provided Mexicans fleeing poor conditions in Mexico with employment opportunities, and many Americans came to the United States legally in the 40s with the implementation of the Brasil program. With good reasons, Mexican Americans were so prideful when it came to their combat record during
the expeditionary unit to fight alongside the Allies in the Second World War. While the squadron was composed of 307 volunteers, only 30 to 31 of them were pilots, while the remaining 270 were ground support crew. On the 24th of July 1944, the Aztec Eagles started training in a US airbase in Texas and continued training at that and various other bases for around 3 months before moving on to Majors Field for advanced combat training. By February 1945, the squadron had graduated from Majors Field, and in March, the unit was en route to the Philippines, arriving in Manila at the end of April.
And let's throw it on to you, Colton.
Thank you, Natalie. Colton? Thank you, Colton. Although many African Americans did participate in the war and did great things, and ultimately were one of the reasons that America ended up winning the war. And, I mean, they did solve some racial problems, but it wasn't enough. And even after the war, there was still a lot of segregation and people being separated by their color. For example, even after the war, many African Americans were still not being treated the best, and white people were definitely being treated more superior.
The number of Black Americans that served in the U.S. Armed Forces during World War II was unprecedented. And yet, the patriotism that so many Black people demonstrated through their service didn't protect them from racism. The armed forces remained segregated in World War II, and Black soldiers and their women's auxiliary units were regularly disregarded and mistreated.
Although many African Americans were still mistreated after the war, even though they fought in the Pacific, the Mediterranean, even the European war zones, including the Battle of Bulge and the D-Day invasion, it was still very wrong that they were still being segregated and not being treated as equally as white people were at the time. But this did inspire many things to come, such as Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, and just many to come that would finally make racism slow down and not as dramatic as it was. Thank you, Colton. Logan?
As I explained before, the Navajo Code Talkers were a Native American tribe that developed codes used by the United States military during World War II and were critical to the success of the Allies during the war. Their codes were used in every major battle in the Pacific Theater against the Japanese during the war, and especially at Iwo Jima, which was a critical battle to the Allies, and the Navajo were critical to the success of that battle. There were over 800 Navajo codes used during the Battle of Iwo Jima. The Navajo Native Americans serving in the United States military at the time also helped to weaken racial barriers, because there was a lot of racist ideology still in the United States.
Thank you, Logan. Natalie?
Thank you so much, Logan. And I'm going to be talking about Mexican Americans and how they contributed to war. Again, Mexican Americans took so much pride when it came to helping out in war, and they contributed in many ways. They fought in almost every major American battle and war, and between 400 and 500,000 Hispanic Americans served in the U.S. Armed Forces. In addition to that, thousands of Mexican nationals living in the United States registered for military services during World War II, and Mexico's own elite air squadron, known as the Aztec Eagles, flew dozens of missions along the U.S. Air Force during the liberation of the Philippines of 1945. So as you can see, Mexican Americans and a lot of Hispanics just tried to do as much as they can and try to contribute as much as they could as well. And I'm going to pass it on to you one more time, Colton.
Okay, that's it for this episode. Thank you so much for watching. Once again, this is Natalie and this is Logan. I'm your host, Colton, and have a great night.